unconventional. So I have really asked him to share about his personal journey, which is beautiful, and then his work with the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, which is incredible when you look at the work that's being done in this country around Buddhism and the research and history. This guy is behind it. So it's really an honor and privilege to have you here, to have you back. You were here in 2021, and we were all covered in masks. So it's nice to see your smiling face. So welcome and good luck with this crowd.
They tell me it's a tough crowd, so I'll do my best. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here again. Yes. How many of you were here on December 18th of 2021? Last time I was here. Okay, good. So then I won't worry about repeating myself because only a few of you were here. Good. It'll be new and fresh for many of you, I hope. I was busy, so I'm kind of recycling my talk. But anyways, I always find a way to add something new to it. So I'm Jann Ronis, third generation San Diegan. On my dad's side, my great-grandparents immigrated from Greece, and they used to have the Ronis market in National City. On my mom's side, our family comes from Mexico, and so we have deep roots to San Diego, but also to the broader world that poured into San Diego over the last 100 years. And then interestingly, I pretty much left San Diego and have spent a lot of my life in Asia doing Buddhist things, but now it's all sort of coming full circle. So I won't talk too much about my journey in any kind of like thematic way. So it won't be, extremely autobiographical in that sense, but I can just mention briefly sort of a few of the local highlights that led me to this point. So the first, if I have to give you just everything in a nutshell, kind of my first introduction to Buddhism occurred in, I think, 1991, must have been 91. That was the International Year of Tibet. So the Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, and then quickly his supporters in the States and elsewhere kind of capitalized on that and brought a lot of attention to the Tibetan issue immediately afterwards. And so 1991 was this very well-organized series of events in the United States, the Year of Tibet. Some of what they did involved bringing Buddhist art to major museums. And so in 1991, I accompanied my mom to San Francisco on a quick business trip. And we visited one of her business associates one day, and we asked him for some advice on what we could do sightseeing-wise after that visit. He said, you have to go to the Asian Art Museum, which at that point was housed in the De Young Museum in Golden Gate Park. Now it's elsewhere in the city, but it was in Golden Gate Park at that time. He said, you have to go. There are some monks there making a sand mandala. It's really incredible. And so I didn't know what a mandala was, but it sounded interesting. We went, and I was just really taken by the monks, the mandala, the thangkas, the statues, all of that. And so that really piqued my interest. And then I came back and I thought, well, I want to be a Buddhist, or at least I want to learn more about Buddhism. It seemed really trippy. That's why I opened up the, because I couldn't speak to the monks. I didn't really know what any of the imagery meant. The symbolism was completely lost on me, but it seemed very cool and interesting and something to think more about, intellectually and also maybe spiritually. And then, of course, the political side of the International Year of Tibet was also very engaging. And so I came home, opened up the phone book, and I saw that there was a Zen Center of San Diego. Maybe some of you have been there in Pacific Beach. So I went there expecting visions and statues and lots of artwork and all of that. That was not the case, not at all. It was lovely and wonderful, but it wasn't exactly what I needed as a 17-year-old or was ready for in terms of a pretty austere form of meditation. And so I did that. Then this was all during my senior year of high school. Went to Hawaii on vacation with my family, and I thought, there's a lot of Asian Buddhists in Hawaii. Maybe I'll give it one more try. Opened up the phone book And yes, under churches, Buddhist, there were a number of temples, and I could sort of recognize the Chinese names, recognize the Zen and other Japanese names, and I saw one temple that had a very distinctive Tibetan name. And I thought, wow, okay, maybe I'll check that out. I called on the phone. This is 1991. They answered, maybe 92 at this point. They answered the phone. I said, hi, I'm visiting. I'd like to come and check it out. What kind of programs do you have? And they said, well, we do puja every morning at maybe 7 a.m., relatively early. We do puja every morning at 7 with the resident Lama. And I said, great, say no more. I want to go. I didn't have a driver's license at this time, and the temple was sort of on the other side of the island. But we had just arrived from California, so we were on a different time zone. 7 a.m. wasn't really that early. So I remember I put the phone down and I went over and I asked my dad, hey, Pop, can you take me to Paella tomorrow morning? There's a Buddhist temple that I want to visit. And he said, yeah, sure. We're going to be waking up early anyways. That should be all right. But what are they going to be doing? And I said, they do puja every morning at 7 a.m. I was just parroting what they had told me on the phone. And he said, okay, but what's a puja? And I said, I don't know, I forgot to ask. But it sounds cool. So anyways, I went there and they had a Lama and I could talk to him. And over a couple of days, I had a more kind of gentle introduction to Buddhism. And I took refuge. Jeff and I were just talking about this. So I did the kind of, confirmation ceremony. And I was given a Buddhist name, Ocean of Perseverance. And so not ocean of wisdom or ocean of patience or gratitude or compassion, just you're a young kid with a lot of energy. All right, I'll recognize that. So anyways, long story short, I never became a very good meditator or a very good Buddhist, but I did get interested in visiting and traveling to Asia, and that's sort of what I'm going to be speaking about today. I can't set myself up as a role model for, how to integrate meditation into your life or how to form a Buddhist community here in America. That's for Jeff and the other long-timers here. But I will tell you, because this is a class on Introduction to Buddhism, I can share from my experience and my work some things that might serve as a good introduction to certain aspects of Buddhism. And before I start and go any further, I want to acknowledge that half of my family is here: my mom, my sister, and my brother. So that's great. Welcome. And then and also Dean Oliver, who is important in the founding and the sustenance of this community and this property here. So thanks you guys for being here. All right, now. I'm going to do a little bit of a show and tell. I hope it's not too classroomy, but I want to start with some kind of broader questions that might open your mind to some new perspectives. And then hopefully when I do my PowerPoint, you'll kind of understand maybe the broader context or how it might relate to you. So here are some questions that I like to pose to audiences like this. And so one would be, do places like this have, communities, institutions that, have an avowed connection to Buddhism, do places like this have any responsibility to Buddhism, Buddhists, Buddhist communities, the tradition in Asia? Does the vitality of communities like this depend on the vitality of Buddhist communities in present-day Asia? And then we can do a vice versa with that. Are the vitality, the growth, the strength, the sustainability of Buddhist communities in Asia, are they dependent on things happening on the other side of the world, which are also Buddhist? Is there a connection there? And then I just want to state that I don't mean to, strengthen this east-west binary. I'm just talking about geographical locations and not like, different types of people or east versus west. But still, this is a big world. There are different places with very different material conditions, political situations, and so forth. So again, these questions. Do we have any sort of responsibility to Buddhism in Asia? Does the growth, strength, depth of our traditions depend on what's going on with Buddhists on the other side of the world, and vice versa? Do quote-unquote traditional Buddhist texts and practices have anything to offer us in the here and now? And if we answer yes to any of those questions, then, well, what can we do about it? How do we act upon our affirmative answers to some of these questions? And I also want to say that it's perfectly fine to answer no to any of these questions as well. That's also a valid answer. So, all right, I wanted to start with those questions. And maybe not go right into a Q&A, but if you have your hand up, I'm happy to.
I was just going to let I just got back from India,
Okay.
and I was at Bodhgaya.
Oh, wow.
And there were different cultures that come together there, and they were extremely happy to hear that Westerners were so, that there was Westerners there to learn, not just a fad, but to learn.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's so true. So I've spent some time in Asia with Buddhists for my work, and you'll hear about it. And a question I always get is, one, is Buddhism popular in the West? Okay, great. Has it fully taken over yet? No. And they're like, well, why not? But then the next question is, to me, have you personally converted your parents to Buddhism yet? And I would say, no. Well, why not? I mean, my God, isn't that, your number one job? And I'll say, well, in America, we have this thing called freedom of religion. And they're like, well, that's not totally convincing, but okay. All right. So now I'd like to, maybe move to my presentation, and we can keep those questions sort of in the back of our mind. I'm not going to directly address them. I'm going to sort of talk about things that are a little more informational, but I think they'll be interesting. And by the end, I think we'll be able to bring them back together. But I thought that, as I said earlier, I can't really offer any Dharma directly to you, not at all. But I can help those of you who are beginners and maybe intermediate Buddhists get a sense for where Buddhism comes from, at least where part of Buddhism comes from, and also how it was transmitted over the centuries and how it got to us. And so in Buddhism, they like to talk about the two aspects of the Dharma. There's the scriptural Dharma and what they call the realized Dharma. So in other words, you have the form of the Dharma that's written down in books or memorized and then transmitted generation to generation. That's half of it. And then the other half is what they call the Dharma of realization, which essentially means the way in which the words are taken into people's hearts and minds, made real, and then also passed on, sort of, from teacher to disciple. I'm not going to talk about the Dharma of realization. Today I'm going to talk much more about the materiality of Buddhism, the real life situation at temples as they try to keep their traditions alive, generation to generation, sometimes just day to day, but into the modern world. And so let's talk about Buddhist books today. It's interesting, I promise you. So Buddhism began. So this, in fact, I should have started with this slide. So what I want to say today, because it's sometimes it contradicts what people might think, but Buddhism is a religion of the book. Sometimes we say that the Western religions are religions of the book because they prize individual bound volumes that they call our book, our Bible. And sometimes it's thought, oh well, Buddhism isn't a bookish religion. They're not prone to being too literalistic or fundamentalist. I I won't, engage in that, but I will say that it is the case that Buddhism really is a religion of the book, in the sense that Buddhists themselves have put tremendous effort into composing scriptures, creating beautiful written texts, and using books for study, but also for ritual and for community building. Just briefly, in case you wanted to kind of put a visual to the history of Buddhism, Buddhism started in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, before the Common Era, right about there. That rectangle represents what they call the Gangetic Plains, the plains of the Ganges River of India, which is not far from where you were. And this country right here, in between Tibet and India, is Nepal. That's where the Himalayas are. And as the snows of the Himalayas melt every year, they flow downwards to India and then down to the Bay of Bengal. So very fertile river valley, and that's where many of the major Indian religions were started around this time period. I won't go into why it was that so many kind of great religious thinkers and leaders all started around the same time in the same place. There's an explanation, but you can read more about that. It's just to say that Buddhism goes way back, 2,500 years, and this is where it started. And so Buddhism was initially an oral tradition. Buddha himself didn't write anything down. Buddha gave a lot of teachings, but he didn't write anything down, partly because at this time in India, spiritual teachings were thought to be too good to be written down. They prized Indians at this time, religious Indians, they prized orality, meaning the memorization of the most important teachings and oral transmission, verbalizing the teachings from one generation to the next. And so Buddha gave a tremendous amount of talks, and often the talks were expressed, or at least sort of memorized, in very mnemonic ways, meaning that there was a lot of repetition and a lot of kind of clues and aids to memorization and repeating, especially in a group setting. You get that sense when you read the earliest teachings. So as soon as the Buddha died, the disciples gathered together and they said, he's gone now. So we don't have him, we don't have the Buddha to correct our memorized scriptures any longer. It's now up to us. All right. All the great masters should get together, and each one should be asked to repeat what he has memorized and heard directly from the Buddha. And if anyone needs to correct it, let's correct it now, and then let's codify it and get 10 people to memorize each of the memorized teachings. And it went on like that for many centuries. This was just how it was done in India at the time. You also found this in Hinduism and Jainism. Buddhism was a missionary religion, and so the monks spread throughout Asia over time, but even very early on, the monks started going in different directions. A question you might have is, did the Buddha speak Sanskrit? Were these early teachings in Sanskrit? And we don't have to go too much into it, but I will say that Buddhism didn't have a sacred language. Sanskrit may be the sacred language of India, and a lot of Buddhist writings are written in Sanskrit, but Buddhists themselves didn't fetishize Sanskrit. In fact, the Buddha was really clear when he said, look, don't worry about don't hold to my language. When you go to a new place and they speak a new language, then on the fly you can translate the teachings. You don't have to stick to the literal expression. The gist is enough. The main thing is to get the points across to people wherever they are in a way that they would understand. So then fast forward about 500 years to the 1st century BCE, there were already Buddhists down in Sri Lanka at this time. And they were teaching the Dharma, so to speak, in the local languages. But then there was a war, and wars lead to famine. And also the Buddhists, as Jeff knows, aren't always so friendly with each other, especially when they're competing for patronage in a far-off place. So things got really desperate for the Buddhists in Sri Lanka around this time. And they were really worried that because of the war, the famine, and then just the infighting, that all the monks might die. And because the teachings only existed in the minds of the monks, that then Buddhism could really disappear in Sri Lanka. And that's not great for humanity. Monks would eventually return, but they wanted to keep it alive any way they could. And so a few of the senior monks said, well, perhaps the only way that we can guarantee that the teachings would outlive just a catastrophic loss of monks would be for us to write the teachings down. Would that be okay? And they decided, yes, it would be. So for Buddhists themselves, that's kind of the origin story of how things got written down. And once they started writing down the scriptures, they never stopped. If you ask about the Buddhist Bible, it's not just one book. It's hundreds of volumes long. And, it's conceivable that the Buddha gave thousands of pages of teachings. But what really happened is that once the monks started writing down the books that they had memorized, sort of from the earliest period of Buddhism, they thought, well, we have some new ideas and some new interpretations. Let's just write those down too. And we can put them in the voice of the Buddha. If it's wise, if it's true, if we consider it to be Dharma, then it really doesn't matter whether the Buddha actually said it or not. And so Buddhism has an open canon that led to just the growth of lots of new teachings. So when you look at the overall corpus, the overall kind of body of Buddhist writings, it's really easy to see that over time, the style, the content changed. It grew, it evolved with the changes to broader Indian culture and just developments within Buddhism. That's really, something interesting to see. Earlier I said that Buddhists weren't too literalistic or fundamentalist, and you really see this in the writings. There could have easily been sort of purges of the non-orthodox writings. It's obvious that some things really came later, but the emphasis was on the meaning, not the origins. And so that led to a very liberal and open canon that can accommodate hundreds of volumes from 1,000 years of writings. All right. But again, let's talk more about the physical texts. So the earliest writings we still have, the earliest writings on media that we have, date also to the 1st century CE, but they weren't from Sri Lanka. They were from an area which at that time was called Gandhara, and is present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. So these are some of the very earliest writings we have. They're 2,000 years old, and they're written on birch bark manuscripts, and the writing is legible to scholars these days. They've decoded it. They know what it means. And then the discoveries have a lot to do with the wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan these days. It was because of bombings and displacement that some of these old archaeological ruins were discovered. And then they thought, oh, this would probably be valuable on the markets down in Pakistan. And they were. So the Buddhists in the old days used to put their scriptures in these clay containers. The writing on the side that's 2,000 years old, and it's people can read it and they know what it means. And then they put the birch bark manuscripts inside. Those are 2,000 years old. They've degraded a lot, but with modern technology, they're able to kind of very gently unroll them and then read them. So that's really 2,000 years old. It's a direct witness to the past. And now you might ask, oh, okay, these are manuscripts from some far off place 2,000 years ago. Is there anything in here that's really unusual and that is no longer in the text that we have today? Some of you know about the Four Noble Truths. So, for instance, did they discover a kind of a fifth noble truth in these teachings, and they didn't. Sadly, there's some new things that they haven't seen before, but it's all pretty much, mainstream Buddhism, which, I want to, put in conversation with the comment I just said about the open canon and the kind of liberal attitude to the teachings. So on the one hand, they've never deviated too far from the originals, but at the same time, there has been a lot of innovation, which is just, I guess, how human culture is. You wouldn't expect something to survive for so long if it didn't grow and always try to adapt. Now, a little interlude. So what's in these books? Because many of us don't read, translations of 1,500-year-old scriptures. They weren't written with us in mind. The newer writings are certainly much more accessible. But just to give you a sense for what the Buddhists were writing down. So there are a lot of sutras, a lot of transcriptions of dialogues by the Buddha. That's to be expected. There's a lot of texts that offer monastic law. The monks, monk organizations can get pretty unruly, and they need a lot of legal writings to make sure that they all stay in line. So the Buddhists, in fact, are thought of being sort of the first legal systematizers in Indian society. So there's a lot on monastic law that talk about the minutiae. Definitely not relevant to us, but the minutiae of monastic law. There's wonderful treatises on philosophy, philosophy about the self, about the origins of the world, about ethics, about metaphysics. Where did the world come from? What's it made of? What's going to happen in 1,000 years? That sort of thing. Guides to contemplation, beautiful meditation manuals are found in the Buddhist texts from all ages. Narratives, so stories, especially stories about the Buddha's previous lives. Right now, I'm sort of making some distinctions between, say, philosophy and narratives and law. But actually, in the Buddhist writings, they weren't themselves thinking about these different genres. They just wrote in different styles. And so what I mean to say is that sometimes the narratives, the stories about the Buddha in a previous life when he was an animal, or about some king, those can have a lot of philosophical content. Or they can have legal content. And sometimes the legal texts have hilarious stories in them. Sometimes, in fact, quite often, it'll say, monks are not allowed to do this. And why? Because once upon a time, some irresponsible monk did this dumb thing. And then they really, tell a story. So it's very memorable. And then they say, and then Buddha had to intervene, and then they go back to the legalistic explanation. So narratives, contemplation, monastic law, and then stories that just, are meant to entertain the populace, the masses. A lot of rituals, as you can imagine, which are a big part of religious life for all people at all times. Astrology, medicine, and then and on and on. But it's essentially Buddhist civilization. The writings were not limited to what you might think are just like a narrow, religious sort of domain. But everything that would be important to a thriving civilization. Medicine, social organization, ethics, philosophy, ritual, and then texts that pertain just to the Buddha himself. So I wanted to mention that, and then, so keep going. Birch bark manuscripts we saw. The Buddhists also wrote on palm leaves. So, whereas in the West or the Mediterranean at this time, writing was done on vellum and papyrus. Exactly, papyrus. So, herbal materials. In India, the equivalent was palm leaf manuscripts, and so there are beautiful palms that grow all over South and Southeast Asia. They're long, fibrous, pretty hardy, and so monks and others for centuries would go and cut down the baby leaves, dry them out, and then cut pages. Each of these could become a page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages were all the same size, and then they would write with a stylus onto them. Because this is organic material, and it's India where they have extreme weather, monsoons, dry heat, and so forth. These didn't last very long. They was about 100 years max, and then monks would have to rewrite them, which led to errors and typos and interesting things creeping in over the centuries. But anyway, this is what palm leaf manuscripts look like. Sadly, there are very, very few living scribes who are still writing palm leaf manuscripts. It's just easier to type them into the computer these days. That makes sense. That's fine. But I'd like to say that the palm leaf manuscripts, Buddhist palm manuscripts we have now, are the last, more or less, that will ever be made. And 100 years from now, most of them will be dust. So we're kind of fighting against time, but things change. But that is important to recognize. So then the palm leaf manuscripts, they bore holes through them and then keep them together because they're just loose leaf with strings. And then the bundles are placed between wooden covers, wooden boards. So that's one of the ways in which the Dharma was written down and transmitted over time. You can see a lot of work goes into this, but it needs to be maintained continuously. And so Buddhist patrons, kings, queens, aristocrats, wealthy merchants, they would sponsor the copying of Buddhist texts as a way to make merit. And so one of the more interesting things when you read these ancient manuscripts is not the content. Often it's sort of the same old thing that we're used to. It's the colophon. So meaning the section at the very end that explains when, why, and how this text was copied. And so you get very earthy dedications from the patrons and the scribe and so forth. This is for a parent or a relative who's just passed on, or this is in order to make merit so that my kid gets into the best college, or the equivalent of that back in the old days, and so forth. Then, of course, Buddhists also wrote on scrolls. This was more common in China, where paper was invented. One reason there are so many Buddhist books, comparatively, there are far fewer writings out of Europe from this time. And it's partly because in Asia, writing materials were just much more abundant. There are beautiful Bibles in Europe, if you go to the museums. Illustrated, but large and heavy. They're written on vellum. Every page is calf skin. You have to kill a baby calf to get 2 or 3 pages. So that's just how it was. They didn't have paper back in the old days. And so, yes, you could pay to have the Bible recopied again and again and again, but writing down your own thoughts, your own poetry, your own ideas, that was only available to the wealthiest people. Whereas in India, Southeast Asia, palm leaf manuscripts, a renewable resource. In China, they could make paper very easily. And so you had long scrolls. So that just gave Buddhist writers a lot more freedom to express themselves and for things to be recopied. Then there were also these concertina format books. I'm just showing this to give you a sense for the kind of art and craft of Buddhist bookmaking. So like an accordion, beautiful calligraphy with notes on that. Oh, so I'll tell you something about this. Paper was abundant, but in certain places it wasn't abundant. It was actually quite costly and had to be brought in from afar. This is just a little side note, but the writing in black, it's pretty clear that's in Chinese. It was. This book comes from Dunhuang, from the Gobi Desert. a place where they didn't have paper had to be brought in back, 1,000 years ago, whenever merchants were passing through or the army came into town, they would bring paper for the monks. So the writing in black is Chinese. The writing in red is Tibetan, the Tibetan script. It's different language, different script, different kind of form of Buddhism. But the monks, back then, the Tibetan monks, clearly, there was a shortage of paper, and this Chinese manuscript had been sort of retired. It was no longer being used. Maybe there's a problem with it, or the pages are missing, and so it's been sort of abandoned. So you can see that a monk picked this up and started writing in between the Chinese lines. Maybe notes to himself, or just trying out some idea or something. But this is not uncommon to encounter the scarcity of materials and how important it was to just use whatever you had to write things down, to learn how to write, to practice your calligraphy, to test out your own ideas and so forth. Then there's beautiful illustrated manuscripts. This comes from Cambodia. And then printing. So up till now we've talked about manuscripts, but Buddhists have always been ahead of the curve when it comes to new media. And printing, I think, is something that can be attributed to Buddhists. The earliest prints that we have in Asia were actually Buddhist talismans, spells, because those needed to be mass-produced. And so they thought, well, we can write them out one by one, or maybe let's experiment. Maybe there's some way that we could have a kind of a printing block for that. And it worked. And then they said, well, maybe we can, mass-produce texts as well, if we find a way to create printing blocks. And so they did. The earliest dated printed book in the entire world is a copy of the Diamond Sutra that's housed at the British Library. It's from 864 or 862, the earliest printed book in the entire world, way before Gutenberg, which was in the 15th or 16th century. So printing Buddhist text originated in China, spread to Tibet, spread to Mongolia, and so for Buddhists, when they hear about the Gutenberg revolution, the printing revolution in Europe, they think, that's kind of quaint that it took you guys so long to learn how to do this. I don't know if there's a historical connection. If Marco Polo saw printed books and slowly over time shared that information with Europeans, but at any rate, this is a printed book. And how did they print? Well, it's called xylography, printing on wooden blocks. So you carve page by page, and you print the writing backwards. And so the printers are usually illiterate. It's preferable if they're illiterate because they're just going by the shapes. They're not trying to think what it means. Because when you do that, then you start to make mistakes because you're printing it. Anyways, they found that if you're literate, it's a deterrent, actually. It's an impediment. So this is a modern day. Printing continues on. I took these photos. And then here's how you print. So that's the block. You put black ink on it, lay a piece of paper down that's the same size, and then you use a roller to print. And the blocks are double-sided. And then you turn it over, flip the paper over as well, and you press it again. And then you've got a sheet of paper, and then you stack them up, and then you let them dry. It's not the main method of reproducing text these days, but the tradition lives on. Yep, here's a whole stack of a fresh text. All right, so what I've been telling you so far is kind of ahistorical. Just sort of the general past and tradition. But in my last 5 minutes, I'd love to talk about Buddhist manuscripts today. Because this is where now the questions I asked you at the beginning come back a little bit. Do we have a connection with Buddhism in Asia? Maybe even a responsibility. What can we do for each other? What can we learn from each other? And so forth. So, Buddhist manuscripts today. Clearly, Buddhism is thriving in many places in Asia. It's suffering, as all religious traditions are around the world. We're going through some changes, but it still exists, for sure. Monks, rituals, the stories, new electronic versions of Buddhist expressions and art. Those are thriving in Taipei, on mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Tibet, in Sri Lanka, and so forth. There are complications, but Buddhism is going strong. I'm happy to report. But maintaining the manuscripts is not easy because it requires space. You have to be really vigilant about making sure there are no fires or floods or pests. And then there's a responsibility to make sure that the climate doesn't cause them to, degrade too quickly. Climate-controlled libraries are not something that most Buddhist monasteries in Asia can afford, but that's kind of what is needed. And so, while in general the Buddhist tradition is going strong, the manuscripts have sort of been suffering because they require sort of extra care, and it's easy for people to think, well, but these are just old manuscripts, and now we have electronic copies, and nobody's reading them anymore anyways. What's the big deal? And so I want to just briefly tell you about that, because that's related to the work I do, the reason Jeff and I got acquainted with each other in the first place. So Buddhist manuscripts today. This is a picture I took. Here we have a stack of Buddhist texts. So they still exist. Oh, this one isn't appearing too well, but this is a photo I took as well. This is an old Lama, an associate of mine. And behind him is a huge library of books. This is his personal collection. So I'm just using this as an example of sort of how there still is an abundance of manuscripts out there, thousands. But in a lot of far-flung monasteries, over the last 150, 200 years, there have been some difficulties. War, the upheaval as societies, move to modernity, changing economic situations, and so forth, plus just the difficulty of maintaining these texts. And so it's not uncommon to go to a monastery and to encounter a situation like this. This is sort of the best that this group can do kind of on their own to keep the manuscript tradition alive. It's sort of more urgent to feed the monks, to maintain the buildings, to try to patch up the murals that are falling apart, and also to make a living and deal with modern life. So sometimes, or rather, many times, the manuscripts sort of are neglected. And it's not just sort of neglect. Sometimes it's because of war. This is a photo that was taken in Cambodia after the end of the Khmer Rouge Civil War. So manuscripts were destroyed. They think that over 95% of the manuscripts that were in Cambodia in, like, say, 1930 have been destroyed. Partly because of the French, but largely because of the war and then just neglect and social changes since the war in the 70s. So it wasn't uncommon in the 80s, for instance, to go to a temple and to encounter a situation like this. Just manuscripts in a really terrible state. None of these are complete texts. Pages were taken by the peasants after their lives had been devastated by the war, and they were weaved into hats. This is strong material. They were used for urgent needs for their daily lives. And so, what can be done to save, preserve, maintain these manuscripts and help pass the contents, if not the physical texts themselves, onto the next generation? That's something that I deal with. So I work for an organization called the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. And we're not alone, but we're one of the larger groups in this domain. We work with our partners in Asia to conserve and then digitally preserve manuscripts on sites. And then the digitized files that we make, the digital text, we then put online on our website for free and open access around the world. But first, what you need to do sometimes is just take the dusty, disorganized text off the shelves, get the locals together, shake them out, and spend a lot of time just putting them back, page by page, into the right orders. And this is something that the Buddhists have a lot of pride in and are very happy to do. So this is often the first thing that needs to be done. Then reorganize them. And this is a photo I took, a friend of mine. And let me skip ahead to the digitization. So digitization. When you're out in the field, sometimes it's kind of the only thing you can do is get a tripod and a text, a digital camera, and then put a little table up against the window because there might not be electricity or it's just too expensive to have lighting, and you take pictures, page by page by page by page. It can take weeks or months to get through an entire library. But if it's not done, in the here and now, there could be a fire, an earthquake, a flood, or just an outbreak of pests that can destroy these things, and they're irreplaceable, gone forever. I would also mention that the black market is a threat to these manuscripts as well. Sometimes the locals will, for some reason or another, sell off their manuscripts to markets down in the city, and they sell them off page by page to tourists. And the tourists, don't know that they're having a really negative impact on a living tradition. They are, but anyways, to prevent that from happening, digital interventions can be very useful. So this is a workstation in Bangkok that we run. This is a more high-tech setup, as you can see. You've got a camera, overhead lighting, overhead camera, and lights on each side, and then we take photos page by page. But the Buddhists themselves, as I said, have always been very innovative when it comes to new media. And so Buddhist monks for 30 years now have been inputting text. Here are some monks who are not on the computer sending emails, but transcribing, typing in old manuscripts. This is a picture I took of monks who are comparing the original text with the new input, editing them. And then after they were finished, the output was a whole new edition with computer font, well edited, of some important texts in their tradition. So I would like to say that what my organization does and our partners is just one of the needed interventions. We're not the only ones helping keep the tradition alive, certainly not. And the ways in which, e-texts, computer input, and so forth is also playing a role is crucial. All right, so I think I would stop there. I think there are, and if you want to ever send me an email or learn more about the organization, bdrc.io. So that is my introduction to Buddhism, to let you know how it is that, in 2024, we are connected in various ways to this living tradition that was maintained through teachings, through art, but also the maintenance of the scriptures, of the physical texts passed on from generation to generation and protected through various difficulties over the centuries until now. Of course, there's a big missing link that I didn't talk about. Translation. It's not as if, we can just import some Cambodian manuscripts and be able to read them directly. No, there's scholarship and translation and interpretation. That's really crucial. That goes without saying. But the manuscripts, the preservation of the manuscripts is something that, often might be overlooked. It's just assumed that, you can go and get some old texts off the shelf and then start, translating them or sharing them. No, they have to be, preserved and put into a format that, easily easily shareable. Because we don't want to go and take the manuscripts from temples in Nepal and bring them to the Library of Congress. That's certainly not fair. And that doesn't solve any problems when it comes to helping the traditions back in Asia stay alive. So anyways, it's a interdependent situation, and the work that is done to preserve the manuscripts is a bright spot, but it's something that will need to continue on for a while. We have 10 minutes, so I'm happy to answer questions about what I talked about, but also if you have any other questions about Buddhism, I'll do my best to answer them. Yes, in the back?
Do you work with Tibetan library works and archives and Polytext Society?
Great question. We work closely with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and in fact on Wednesday we just posted a new blog post and a newsletter about a new cache of texts that we put online that come from the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. So I'm not here to toot my own horn. It's really I just wanted to introduce the situation on the ground more generally. But I think this Library of Tibetan Works and Archives project is a good example of how we need each other, East and West. So the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala has an amazing collection. A lot of the refugees who fled the Chinese takeover of Tibet went to India. They brought manuscripts with them, and as the first generation of Tibetan refugees has passed on, many of them have donated the manuscripts they brought from Tibet to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. Others were donated to monasteries. That makes sense too. But a lot went to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. Recently, they got a large grant, over $200,000 from the Mellon Foundation to digitize their manuscripts. Wonderful. They digitized the manuscripts. Okay, and then, it became sort of apparent that was only stage one. It's great to digitize them so that in case there's a fire or an earthquake in Dharamsala, there are backup copies. But if there's no digital platform to disseminate the texts, well then, that's a bummer. Because it is possible to share them more widely. And that was the ultimate goal of this digitization project. Not just to salvage the text, but to make them widely available. Well, it would be very costly for Library of Tibetan Works and Archives to set up a server and a website and to maintain it and so forth. That wasn't, part of the plan. So they reached out to us. We have the website. We have the archivists. We have the technologists. And we have a wonderful database. So they offered to share their digital files with us if we could, sort of reciprocate with a second level of cataloging, with archiving the text and then putting them online and integrating them into our broader library. And so that was a project we did this summer and fall, and we just finished the last text this week and put them all online. So yes, we work with them. We don't work with the Polytext Society, but we do work in Southeast Asia. So we have two big projects in Southeast Asia. One is with Burmese texts. It's based in Bangkok, and another in Cambodia. The Cambodia project is over now. We digitized 1.3 million pages of Cambodian texts. It was something we did during the pandemic. And I want to thank our sponsors, again, about interdependence. It's a family that supports a Cambodian temple in San Jose.
In San Jose, California.
In San Jose, California, yes.
Thank you for doing that. I started out in the Cambodian temple. So.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, this is now the greatest digital library of Cambodian texts, Cambodian manuscripts. And we hope to get more sort of uptake from the community. Yes?
By and large, what is in the manuscripts? Is it a history or is it commandments, if you will? I mean, in the Bible, it's basically a history. It's a bunch of stories.
Yes.
And with a bunch of commandments sprinkled in there.
Sure.
So...
Great question. Yeah. So let's get back to this. So what's in the books, right? And that gets to, their potential relevance for us. So the books basically contain the local civilization. It wouldn't be accurate to say they're just Buddhist books. The literate people in these different societies were the monks. And so while most of these texts were written by monks and they exist at the monasteries, really they cover the whole civilization. So astrology, medicine, history, poetry, literature, and then the canon law, meaning the monastic law that governs the monks. So that's not, very accessible to everybody else. And then the Buddhist writings, meaning meditation, philosophy, sermons of the Buddha, that kind of thing. It's very broad. And that's why they need to be preserved. They don't contain just Buddhist writings. It's the history, the arts, the sciences of the Cambodian people, or the Burmese, or the Tibetans. Yeah. And so hopefully, as these things become more accessible, then scholars of history and culture and literature will gain more access to them and be able to do their own studies. Even if they feel like, oh, these might be Buddhist. I'm not a specialist in Buddhism. No, actually, once they're better cataloged and more technologies are applied to them, then they can contribute to the humanistic sciences more broadly. What I didn't mention is AI and how AI can be helpful with this. We work with optical character recognition, basically training AI computer vision models to recognize the writing encoded in the images, in the two-dimensional images. And so it'll recognize the script and extract it and basically put it into a Word document that you can copy and paste. And so when we started with this, it was just amazing that it could just take the text, pull it out, and put it into a document for copy-paste, for editing, reformatting, reprinting. That alone was really cool. And then digital dictionaries started to appear. Oh, okay, we can copy and paste individual words, put it into the dictionary. Well, now we have machine translation for a lot of these texts. So I would say that the cutting edge of machine translation for classical Buddhist texts is occurring at UC Berkeley. It's a project called Dharma Mitra, dharmamitra.org. And they've got amazing machine translation. So actually, this thing, or rather, this project is really speeding up, and the gaps are closing quickly. We're soon going to be able to have, machine-produced translations of thousands, maybe millions of pages of these writings. And that'll allow us to get a sense for, are there meditation methods that we haven't seen before? Or are there, some local histories or some literature or astrological writings that haven't yet been translated or discovered that might have something to say to us? It's all going to be much more accessible, legible, and able to be taken up by us and used in ways that can assist with our own practices of Buddhism. That's, I don't know why I didn't include it in the slides, but that's happening as well. Yes?
It's kind of, maybe it's a silly question. When you talk about them writing on palm leaves,
Sure.
You mentioned that they did it with a stylus.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by a stylus?
All right. So it's the way they do it is quite interesting. So what I mean by a stylus is really just a very sharp point. So with palm leaf manuscripts, what you do is you carve the writing with basically a knife. They call it a stylus because it's for the purpose of writing, but you're essentially just carving into the palm leaf. And then after you've carved it, you sprinkle black ink, powdered ink, over it, and then you wipe it, and the ink will stay in the grooves, and the rest that's just on the surface, that's not part of the writing, that will be, blown off or brushed off. And so what you're looking at is, ink in a groove. And that can be, blown away or deteriorate. And so every couple of years, if they want to reuse a text, they will re-ink it.
That's interesting.
And so that's the only way you can see it, is if you add the ink to it. Otherwise, you just see etchings.
Right, okay. That's what they're doing, is kind of etching
They're etching
the form.
with a stylus. Oh, yes.
So, what, from the earliest writings, which denomination of Buddhism follows the original oldest writings? Because if it's not from right?
So that's a great question. It's a loaded question. So I'll give you an answer that's, actually sort of historically well-informed and is also diplomatic at the same time. The truth is, we don't know what the original teachings were, because they weren't written down for hundreds of years. By the Buddhist own admission, they weren't written down for hundreds of years. And the first writings, but the story of the first writings, it was in Sri Lanka. But then the first texts we have were from 1,500 miles away in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Buddhism had spread that far, within a couple of hundred years. The early writings that we have from Afghanistan and Pakistan, those are the earliest writings, and they do not conform completely to the writings of the Theravada. They resemble it, but they're not the Theravada teachings. But still, history is history. There were earlier teachings. I mean, as I freely admitted just now, the canon is open, and for hundreds of years, 1,000 years, Buddhists were writing new scriptures in the name of the Buddha, in the mouth of the Buddha. So it is true that there are things that are later, even though they're orthodox. So it's, just sort of, we have to accept both sides of this coin. But one way to think about the Theravada, now maybe not being so political here, but the Theravada teachings, in a sense, are kind of like neoconservative. One way to think of them is that at some point they thought, things are changing, there are some earlier teachings, and let's create a canon that is like overtly early, that has that air and style and content that is early, but it's not like an unbroken direct link to the past. So that's what I would say. But the earliest are these teachings from Gandhara, and what's great is that you can see both early Mahayana and early kind of Theravada or Hinayana, both there, side by side.
I have kind of a naive question,
Sure.
I think. When you digitize physical writing from, say, Cambodia,
Yes.
and then you put it up on the web
Mhm.
for everyone to be able to access, you're
Yes.
putting it into the public domain,
Into the public domain.
and then what intellectual property rights does, say, Cambodia retain, if any, for
Yes.
the antiquity side of the physical property, or the intellectual property, or
Yes.
do they?
Well, so that's a really important question, and this gets to the ethics of what we do. And so one way to shine bring this into relief is to say that there are some temples that don't want their manuscripts preserved. They don't want anybody else's help, and we can say, but there could be an earthquake tomorrow. Why not? And they have the autonomy, agency, and say over this. So we certainly can't force anybody to collaborate with us. Fortunately, most of the time, people want to be involved. And when we do, we tell them that it will be put in the public domain, open access, that BDRC does not have a subscription service, these will never be sold, and so forth. And that's pretty compelling to most people. But there definitely have been times when a temple has said, okay, 80% of this can be scanned and put online, no problem. But this 20%, we want to reserve it for ourselves. Digitize it, but give us the files. And you can have a copy for backup, but it's not to go online because it's secret, or it's just our patrimony, it's our heritage, and we might lose our mojo if it, in some way, if it goes online and everybody can see it. We want to be the gatekeepers for it in a very legitimate sense.
What about cybersecurity?
And cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is definitely an issue. We try to keep up with the industry standards for data storage, which is just to say that you want multiple copies in different locations. So we spend a lot of money every year, $50,000 every year just on data storage, because we have to have 3 copies in 2 locations, one of which is in the cloud. So we do that. But then we also have almost everything backed up to the Internet Archive, who you must know. And then we have a connection with Harvard Digital Repository Service. And so we upload things to Harvard, but that is a much slower process. Harvard will outlive my organization. Internet Archive will outlive my organization as well, although they were hacked really severely just 2 months ago. So no, it's difficult. And then one last thing, I was talking just now about our relationship to like individual monasteries, but there are definitely countries that have laws governing manuscript heritage. When we went into Cambodia, the nation of Cambodia didn't yet have a law on the books governing their manuscripts. They were working on it, they didn't have it. So when we went in, they said, wow, we see that you can get this done, but we don't have really rules at the national level about whether you're allowed to do it, what you can do with the materials, and so forth. So we don't want to participate, just at the level of the Ministry of Culture. So we did not digitize the National Library, the National Museum, the Silver Pagoda. Basically all the great collections in Phnom Penh were closed to us. They essentially said, we don't want to know, we don't want to hear, we don't want to be involved. We're not going to ask for bribes either. Just do what you can do in the countryside. And so we did. Maybe their new laws will be retroactive or something, and then we'll have to come to some mutual agreement with them. But in that case, they didn't want to be involved. We have a big project at the National Library of Mongolia. They're very concerned about where and how we will use their work. And we're always being, this is off the books, we're regularly being sort of accused of profiting off of their manuscripts. So now, or we were, and so now we just don't include them in our fundraising at all. I mean, we thought, hey, this is a really virtuous project. It's worthwhile. People would love to hear about it. And they said, oh, you're just including it in your fundraising emails because you're trying to make money. And so now we just simply don't publicize that project, and we're just doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. But we understand that for cultures that have experienced colonialism and a serious oppression, that you never know who these wealthy people from outside are and what their real motivations are. So we totally respect that. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, that gets to the heart of it. Why and what say? Why are our partners participating, cooperating, and what kind of say do they have?
Well, and for the benefit of whom?
And for the benefit of whom?
And
yes.
Does a country get to retain the ownership and
yes.
and control rights and permissions for their raw material, which would be the writing.
Yes, absolutely. And then, many of these countries are multi-ethnic. So should, the dominant population of one country have a say over the digital preservation of a minority group in their country? Sometimes we're stuck in the middle, definitely between copyright. Copyright, we digitize modern books as well, if they're the only copy of an old manuscript. And then, well, Do we follow copyright law, international copyright law, which is commercial, or the monks themselves who say, please, I can't afford to buy this book, or I just can't get it where I am. Why don't you digitize it and put it online for free access? Yeah. So it's complicated. Maybe should we have one last question?
Yeah.
All right. Oh gosh, we've gone way over. All right. An easy one, please.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, the Gandhara writings.
Yes.
I think that occurred probably around the time of Alexander the Great,
Yes.
and I'm aware that at least the art shows a lot of Greek influence.
It does. Yes.
Do you see Greek influence in the writings?
I don't, but certainly people have looked into this and thought that maybe Pyros, they've said, oh, I see maybe the Buddhist inspired, is it Pyros? P-H-R-R-O-S, but somebody who they say, oh, maybe he influenced the Buddhists, or maybe the Buddhists influenced him. But in terms of the writings,
I've read that.
yeah, there isn't signs of very much cross-fertilization. In the artwork, there is.
Yes.
Absolutely. The monks from Gandhara are wearing togas. The top knots are very Greek.
Right.
But not so much for the writings. This gets to the conservatism that I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
No.
All right. Well, thank you all. This was very fun for me, very interesting, and then we'll continue on with our Buddhist journeys. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if I didn't mention how brilliant Jann was in the introduction, now you've seen it live in person. The other thing I also didn't mention in the intro was in all the stuff that got sent out, and even you mentioned very quickly and humbly how you worked there. He's also the executive director of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, so knows a few things about it, and I'm sure is happy to answer any more additional questions. But I just want to thank you for being here, for making the time.
Sure.
And now that I know you're back in San Francisco, maybe we'll get you down here more often.
Yes.
Because there's a lot more here. So thank you for everything, for your work.
Yeah.
All of you who read Pema Chodron, Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, all that stuff, none of that is possible without the work that people like Jann, Buddhist Digital Resource Center have been doing for the last 2,000 years. 1,000 years from now, they'll be talking about these folks and the work they're doing. Like, this is what makes the history of Buddhism possible. It's what makes your practice possible, is all the work that these people have done. So thank you for all your work.
I wish the Dharma Bum Temple had been around in 1991 when I was 17.
That would have been fun. Yeah, we probably would have burned it down together, but it's still. But thanks all for being here. If you're here for the first time, welcome to the Dharma Bum Temple. We opened only 18 years ago to introduce Buddhist practice to local folks. Those of us who lead, other than when we bring in the wonderful guests, are not monks, nuns, gurus, masters, teachers. We're not looking for students. We're just practitioners. So every night we have different practices going on, different people leading from different Buddhist traditions. Every Thursday at 4:30, we do, I think, probably the best thing around here, is we prepare gourmet vegetarian meals, also known as peanut butter and jelly, and we feed people who sleep on the streets. So anytime you lack gratitude for all you have in your life, feed people who sleep on a sidewalk. It tends to put things into perspective. Every Tuesday, we also work with PATH, people assisting the homeless, so it's another great opportunity. First Saturday of the month, we have a 4-hour day of silence retreat, which will be coming up. Other than that, holiday schedule is the same. We don't change anything for the holidays. The holidays are often the hardest times for people. And at that time, a place like this is needed the most. So all of our schedule will stay the same. Buddha for you is downstairs if you need anything. Thank you all again, Jann. Thank you for everything. You're brilliant. We love you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I hope to be back again. Yeah.